Masechet Shevuot Taf Mem Zayin. Haya echad mehen mesachek bekubya. The Mishnah was listing various people who are not trustworthy to take an oath. And the list already said someone who took an oath and was found to be lying is no longer trusted to take an oath in the future. And then the Mishnah continued and gave more examples, and also someone who plays with dice, a gambler, and other people like that. Hatula mali. Now the Gemara asks, why do I need more examples? And the answer is, Tana pisula deoraita, v'katane pisula de rabbanan. First, the Mishnah lists those who are invalid to take an oath on a Torah level. If they already lied in a Shevuot Pikadon or Shevuot Edut, well then we're not going to trust them any further to take a vow in the future. And that's a Deoraita law. Once we mention those, then we list those that the rabbis decided these people are not trustworthy because either they're considered like stealing, because usually in gambling, the other person thinks they're going to win. They don't really willingly give you the money. So if you win, then it's kind of like stealing, or because they're not involved in settling of the world. They're wasting their time. And so they don't value time. They don't value money. And so we cannot trust them to swear about something monetary. Either way, they are also not valid to make a vow. Hayushanehem chashudin. The Mishnah went on to the next case where both litigants are suspect. If only one is suspect, let's say the defendant is not valid to make an oath, then we switch the oath. Instead of the defendant making a vow and not paying, we put the onus on the plaintiff, and the plaintiff can make a vow and collect. But what if both of them are invalid? The Mishnah has a machloket, and in the Mishnah's version, it says that according to the Biyoseh, we return the oath to its place. We'll see what that means. And according to the Bimeir, since nobody can take an oath, we divide it, yachloku, and they split it half-half. Because either of them could take the oath. If either one could take the oath, then they would collect. But both of them have the same problem. So we should split the claim right down the middle. Amar le Rava Rav Nachman, hechi tenan, amar le layadana, hilchetamai, amar le layadana. Rava asked Rav Nachman, how do you read this Mishnah? What's your version of the Mishnah? In our version, Rabbi Yoseh is the one that says, return it to its place. But there's another version that switches it around. So what do you have? And Rav Nachman says, I don't know, I'm not sure. He asked a follow-up question, who does the halacha follow? This question is related to the previous one, because generally, the halacha is like Rabbi Yoseh, against his colleagues. So if whichever one you say is Rabbi Yoseh is probably going to be the halacha. So here he says, and what's the halacha like? And Nachman says, I don't know, I'm not sure. Itemar, Amar Rav Yosef, Bar Yomi, Amar Rav Nachman. Rabbi Yoseh Omer Yachloko, V'chen Tane, Rav Zevid Bar Oshaya, Rabbi Yoseh Omer Yachloko. Now we do have another statement that includes Rav Nachman. So Rav Yosef Bar Yomi says in the name of Rav Nachman, that Rabbi Yoseh is the one that says you should split it. That is not the same as what we have. In our Mishnah, Rabbi Meir is the one that says divide it. But here, Rav Nachman is quoted as saying that one should split it. So even though in this previous Gemara, we have Rav Nachman saying he's not sure, over here, Rav Yosef ben Yomi at least does have a tradition in the name of Rav Nachman that Rabbi Yosef says Yachloku, and presumably then that would be the halacha too. And also, Rav Zevid Bar Oshaya has a baraita, and then that baraita, Rabbi Yosef is the one that says Yachloku. Good. Ikad Amre, another version of the two statements that we just said. Taneh Rav Zevid Amar Rabbi Oshaya, Rabbi Yosef Omer Yachloku. This is an alternate version of the second one. You see in the first version, it says, Taneh Rav Zevid Bar Oshaya, Rav Zevid the son of Oshaya. Here is Rav Zevid himself has a braita in which he quotes Rabbi Oshaya. So this is Rav Zevid quoting Rabbi Oshaya, quoting a braita where Rabbi Yosef. So it's the difference between Rav Zevid in the name of Rabbi Oshaya versus Rav Zevid the son of Oshaya. Okay, anyway, one or the other has a braita where it's Rabbi Yosef that says to split. And the other statement is Rav Yosef Bar Yomi, Avad Rav Nachman Obada Yachloku. This is another alternate version of the first statement. In the first statement, Rav Yosef ben Yomi is quoting Rav Nachman as saying that according to the Biyoseh, he says Yachloku. According to the second version, he is not quoting a statement that Rav Nachman said, but rather he witnessed a case that came before Rav Nachman in which Rav Nachman was a judge, and Rav Nachman ruled Yachloku. since he followed the halacha of Yachloku, so that means that he probably attributed it to Rabbi Yosef, because Rabbi Yosef, the halacha follows him. Okay, so anyway, the consensus of all these seems to be that that halacha should be Yachloku, and therefore also Rabbi Yosef should be the one that to whom we attribute it, which is the opposite of the version of our Mishnah. In any case, now we're going to go back to the version of our Mishnah and analyze it as is. Chazra Shevuot limkom ha. Rabbi Yosef in our Mishnah says that if neither party can make an oath, then the vow returns to its place. Where is that? Lehechan chazra amar Rabbi Ameh Rabotenu shebeBavel ameru chazra Shevuot leSinai. Rabotenu sheberetz Yisrael ameru chazra Shevuot lemechoyav la. So where does it go back to? Rabbi Ameh says the sages in Bavel said it goes back to Sinai. In other words, since nobody can make a vow, nobody pays. Instead, the matter goes back to Har Sinai, where all the Jewish people made a vow that said we will keep the Torah, and therefore Hashem will administer justice in His own way. It's not up to us. We can't. We have the power to administer an oath, but only if someone can make an oath. If nobody's trustworthy to make an oath, it's out of our hands. So it'll go back to the vow that everybody made at Har Sinai, and the vow at Har Sinai includes consequences if we don't follow it. So it will be in God's hands. However, the sages in Eretz Yisrael said, no, Chazra Shevuah means it goes back to the person who originally is supposed to make it. If it's a Modeh B'Miksat, for example, that's the defendant that admitted half and denied half, so from the Torah he has to make a vow. If he's invalid, we'll give it to the plaintiff. If the plaintiff is invalid also, we send it back to the defendant. Since the defendant can't make a vow to get out of it, the defendant has to pay the entire amount. So that's the rule. The defendant can only get out of payment of Modeh B'Miksat if he makes a vow. Now he can't, and nobody can, so the defendant has to pay instead. Amar Papa, Rabotenu shebeBavel, Rav Shmuel, Rabotenu sheberetz Yisrael, Rabbi Abba. Now Rav Papa identifies who these sages are that Rabbi Ameh talked about, and he says when he said the sages in Bavel, that was talking about Rav and Shmuel specifically, and the sages in Eretz Yisrael was talking about Rabbi Abba specifically. Rabbeinu shebeBavel, Rav Shmuel ditnan. Now we're going to identify the statement of Rav and Shmuel, in which we can see that they say that nobody pays. It goes back to Sinai, divine punishment, but in court, since nobody can swear, nobody will pay. We see that Rav Shmuel say such a law in their comment on the Mishnah that we are already read. Ditnan, v'chen hayetomim lo yipareu ela bishbuah. The Mishnah taught that orphans cannot receive payment, collect payment, unless they make a vow. V'avinanva, miman. Now the question we asked when we analyzed this Mishnah is, from whom? Who are they collecting from? That they have to make a vow. Ilema mi loveh, if they're collecting from a borrower, meaning their father had lent money to someone, and now their father died, so they want to collect the loan, and so they're going directly to the borrower to collect it. Well, in that case, they shouldn't have to make a vow, because if their father were alive, we're assuming they'll say the father has proof, like a loan document. So the father would be able to collect without making a vow. So should the orphans then have to make a vow? We should take it easy on the orphans, if anything. So if the father could collect without a vow, the children also should not have to collect, should not have to make a vow either. So it's not talking about that case. Rather, it's when orphans are collecting from orphans. There was a lender and a borrower, and both the lender and the borrower died. And now the orphans of the lender are coming to the orphans of the borrower and saying, we want to collect our father's loan that he gave to your father. In that case, they have to make a vow in order to collect. Good. Now comes Rav and Shmuel, who qualify this. V'Rav u'Shmuel damre tarvayhu lo shanu ela shemet malveh bechaye loveh. Rav and Shmuel say that this law that the orphans of the lender have to make a vow in order to collect, that's only true if the lender died first, while the borrower was still alive. In that case, so if we freeze it there, the lender died, the orphans can go directly to the borrower himself and say, our father had this loan, you were supposed to pay him, now we want you to pay us. And in that case, they would be able to get paid without a vow. Since that's true, when the borrower dies, now there is going to be a vow, because the borrower himself, they didn't have to make a vow to him, but now they want to collect from the orphans, and the father of the borrower dying triggers a vow, because in order to collect from orphans, you have to take a vow, even if the people collecting are themselves orphans. So in that case, that's what this Mishnah is talking about, where it says orphans have to make a vow in order to collect from other orphans when the lender died before the borrower. However, the other way around, aval met loveh bechaye malveh, kevan nitchayev malveh libnei loveh shevuah, ve'nadam morish shevuah lebanav. If the borrower died first, then the lender would go directly to the orphans, and the lender, because he's collecting from orphans, would have to make a vow. So now the vow is already triggered during the lifetime of the lender. Now the lender himself dies, and there's a rule that you don't bequeath an obligation of a vow to one's children. So because they were supposed to, the father would have had to make a vow in order to collect, but now he died, now the children cannot make a vow and collect. They lose their right to collect because they can't make a vow on behalf of their father. That's it. There's no more obligation. So we see from here that this is a case where neither party can make a vow, and Rav and Shemuel say that there is no vow. You don't send it back to the original, but rather there's no vow at all. And so that's exactly what it says here. The rabbis in Bavel say that when neither party can make a vow, then it goes back to Sinai, meaning that nobody makes a vow at all. So that's where we see Rav and Shemuel thought that opinion. Rabotenu sheberetz Yisrael. Now, how do we see that the rabbis in Eretz Yisrael say that when neither party can make a vow, then it goes back to the original, and since the original guy cannot make a vow, then he has to pay. The defendant would have to pay in such a case. So, whereas according to Rav and Shemuel, when they say it goes back to Sinai, means no one pays. But here we do pay. So where do we see that? That we see that in Eretz Yisrael, Rabbi Abba. So we identified the sage of Eretz Yisrael with Rabbi Abba, and we see Rabbi Abba's opinion in this case. Someone snatched a piece of metal that was valuable from his friend. So you have the snatcher and the person who, the victim. Now the victim comes to Rav Ameh and say, this guy, he snatched this precious metal from me. Yatib Rabbi Abba kameh. Rav Ameh was the judge, but Rabbi Abba, he's the sage of Eretz Yisrael that we identified, was sitting before Rav Ameh as a student, listening. There was one witness that saw this guy snatch. So we have one witness. Generally, one witness will trigger a vow. It's not enough to collect, but it is enough to trigger a vow that the plaintiff says he snatched, and I have one witness. So now let the snatcher, the defendant, make a vow that he didn't take it. But here's the catch. The defendant says, he admits, indeed, I did snatch it, but it belonged to me. He took it from me beforehand, and really it was mine, and so therefore I had the right to snatch it. Rabbi Ameh was in a quandary. How can I judge this case? Should I tell the snatcher that he has to go and pay? We don't have two witnesses, so I can't make him pay based on one witness. So I send him home and say you don't have to pay anything, but there is one witness, so he should have to make a vow. Should I tell him to make a vow? The problem is he admitted himself that he snatched something, and snatching things without permission is a robber. So once someone is a robber, they're not trustworthy to make an oath. So he can't make an oath. So Rabbi Ameh didn't know what to do. Amar le Rabbi Abba, hava mechuyav Shevuah ve'en yachol lishaba, ve'chol mechuyav Shevuah ve'en yachol lishaba mishalem. Rabbi Abba, the student, was sitting there and says, oh, I know, this is a case of someone who is supposed to make a vow because there's one witness against him, but he can't make a vow because he admitted to being a thief. And the rule is anyone who has to make a vow and cannot make a vow ends up paying. So you see here that Rabbi Abba says when there's no possibility of administering a vow, then we make the person pay. And that's what the sages of Eretz Yisrael said above, who we identified with Rabbi Abba. So this is the source of Rabbi Abba's statement. Amar Rava, kivated Rabbi Abba mistabera, tetane Rabbi Ameh. Shevuat Hashem tiyeh ben shenehem, velo ben hayroshim. Hechid ameh. Rava says, I have a source, a braita, that is in accordance with Rabbi Abba, that someone who can't make a vow, still, then if nobody can make a vow, then the defendant will have to pay. Because we have a braita said by Rabbi Ameh, quoting the pasuk, the oath of Hashem will be between both of them. So, and that means between both of them and not with the orphans. That's what the braita says. Hechid ameh. What case is it talking about? Ilem adamar le maneh le abba biyad avicha, v'amar le chamshin it le, chamshin let le, mali hu, mali abuha. If it's a case where one set of orphans say that your father owed my father 100 zuz, and the other orphans say, no, he owed him only 50, and we owe you therefore only 50. So now in that case, the other orphans would certainly have to make a vow of modeh b'miksat, because what's the difference if it's the fathers or it's the orphans? So the fathers are dead, now the orphans are making a claim. One makes a claim for 100, the other one makes a claim for 50, so he could make a vow. No, we make a vow that we owe you 50 was paid, and we only owe you 50, and then they'll pay 50. So that's a simple case. We wouldn't need a special derasha just for that case. Rather, the case of that baraita must be where the orphans of the lender say, your father owed my father 100. And the orphans of the borrower say, listen, we know about 50 that our father owed your father. That we admit to that part. But the other 50, we don't know. Now, because they say we don't know, they can't possibly make an oath because they have no idea. So what happens then? That's why the Baraita comes to teach that Shevuot benehen against the fathers, the principals, they make one makes a vow, but orphans, one orphans to the other, they do not make a vow. Now let's analyze this statement. If you say that the fathers in a similar situation. In other words, let's say the fathers are alive. One says, you owe me 100. And the other, the father, the borrower says, listen, 50 I owe you. The other 50 I don't know. The father himself is not sure. If you say that in such a case that that borrower would be liable to make a vow. Now, he can't make a vow because he doesn't know, so he'll end up having to pay. If that's true, then the Baraita makes sense. That's why the Baraita would come and say, listen, the father would be liable to take an oath. If he can't oath, he has to pay. But the sons, the orphans, they don't have to make a vow and don't have to pay. Then the Baraita has something to teach us. But but if you would say that in such a case, the father himself would not have to make a vow and would not have to pay, then of course, obviously the orphans would not have to make a vow or pay either. Therefore, it must be the first option that has to come teach us that the orphans don't have to make a vow because the father in that situation would have to make a vow. So that's the proof. It's from the fact that we can infer from the fact that the sons are the orphans don't have to make a vow, we can infer that the father would have to make a vow. And he can't make a vow because he's not sure, and so therefore he has to pay. So this is a case of where nobody can make a vow, and yet they have to pay. That's Rabbi Abba's opinion. that when neither side can make a vow, we return the vow to the defendant, and the defendant has to pay. So we see there is a braita that supports Rabbi Abba. Now, Rav and Shmuel would disagree with this whole thing, with all the Rasha, because they would say that when nobody can make a vow, nobody pays. You send it back to Har Sinai. So therefore, what are they going to do with this pasuk? Shimon ben Tarfon omer Shevuot Hashem tiyeh ben shenehem melamed she'Shevuah chala al shenehem. So they need this pasuk as Shimon ben Tarfon teaches in the Baraita that quotes this pasuk, the Shevuah Hashem will be between them. This teaches that the responsibility of having to make an oath applies to both of them. In other words, if someone makes a false oath, certainly let's say the defendant who took the false oath is certainly responsible. But not only that, also the plaintiff who brought him to court and didn't keep his record straight in the first place, didn't do things with witnesses, and had this confusion and brought him to court and put him in a situation where this would happen, and that he would make a false oath. Although it's obviously more responsible, that direct punishment will be on the one who took the oath by the false oath. But Ben Shenehem, the other guy, also probably has some responsibility and could have done some kind of better job, and therefore shares some of the desecration of the God's name for the false oath. Since we quoted one statement by Shimon ben Tarfon, we quote a couple more. Shimon ben Tarfon omer, Azhara lo kebachar noef minayin, tamod omar lo tinaf lo tanif. How do you know that someone who helps out an adulterer, he helps him out, he provides assistance, he drives him, whatever, is also guilty? Because we can read lo tinaf, do not commit adultery. We can vocalize it as lo tanif, do not cause someone or aid in someone committing adultery. Ve'teragenu ba'ahol lechem. Shimon ben Tarfon omer, tartem v'ginitem ba'aholo shel makom. When the pasuk Parashat HaShavua, coincidence, that actually is from Devarim, but it's about the spies, and it says that Moshe tells the people, you murmured in your tents. But a curious word, teragenu, what does that mean? Shimon ben Tarfon says it's a combination of two words, tartem and ginitem. You explored the land and you disparaged the land in the tent of Hashem. And so that's the word, he's explaining what the word means. Another teaching by Shimon ben Tarfon, Omer, explaining why is Euphrates called a great river. What's great about it? Kerab legabe dihina ve'idahan, deber b'Yishmael tana, ebed melech kemelech. So we quote the common statement, draw close to the anointed one, and you'll be anointed as well. Anointed means the king. If you come close to a king, then you'll be like a king as well. As Rabbi Ishmael taught in a Baraita, the servant of a king is like a king, in that he lives in the palace. You want to live in the palace? There's two ways to live in the palace. You could be king, or you could be a servant of the king. If you're a servant of the king, you're still going to enjoy the beautiful atmosphere of the palace. You might sleep in the palace. You're going to eat probably the same food as the king, and so hang out. And that's the point here also. What's so great about the Euphrates? It's near Israel. And just the fact of being near Israel, that already gives it greatness. Mishnah continued and said, if you have a case where someone, an employer, tells the storekeeper, listen, can you give payment to this worker and that worker, and then I'll pay you back after. Says, sure, no problem. And then the worker comes and says, hey, I never got my money from the storekeeper. He never paid me. And the storekeeper said, I did. I paid him. The law is that both the worker and the storekeeper can make a vow regarding their claims, and both can collect from the boss. So the boss is going to have to pay twice, actually, because each of them has a claim and each of them makes a vow, even though the two vows contradict each other, because the storekeeper is making a vow that he didn't pay, and the employee is making a vow that he didn't get paid. Well, one of them is lying, and yet both of them make a vow. That's according to Tanakama. Tanya, Amar Rabbi, Torach Shevuah Zo Lama. Braita quotes Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya saying, the trouble of this oath, why do we need it? This is such a problem. We're making them both take oaths, and the oaths are going to be contradictory. This this is not a good situation. Now, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, we usually say, is the editor of the Mishnah. So presumably he put this Mishnah there, and yet in this Baraita, Rabbi himself is wondering about it. And so, Amar lo Rabbi Chia, Tanena, Shenehem Nishba'in V'notlinu Bal Habayit. In fact, Rabbi Chia, student of Rabbi, quotes the Mishnah and says, what do you mean? It's in the Mishnah that says both of them make a vow and they can collect from the homeowner. So the question is, kibela mineh or lo kibela mineh? Did Rabbi accept that, oh yeah, that's the Mishnah, that's the way it is? Or did he not accept it and he disagreed with it? Sometimes the Rabbi Yehuda Nasi puts in the Mishnah opinions that he himself doesn't necessarily agree with. He's more of a collector, an editor. It's not his own. It's not his own teachings. It's not his own law book. But he would collect and put things in there. And so, even though this is in the Mishnah, the question is, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi questioned this halacha, and Rabbi Chia answered it. Oh, but look, it's in the Mishnah. So shouldn't that be the halacha? We don't have his response. So we're going to try to figure out what was Rabbi's response. Tashima Detanya. Rabbi Omer, Po'ali nishparin lachen vani. Well, we have a baraita in which Rabbi Yehuda Nasi says that the workers should make a vow to the shopkeeper. So that would mean that they make a vow and then they say, we never got paid. If they're making it to the shopkeeper, then that sounds like the shopkeeper then will pay the employees and not the boss. So that sounds like he in fact disagrees with the Mishnah. If he would agree with the Mishnah and change his mind regarding his question, then he should have said that the employee makes a vow to the boss, which is what the Mishnah said. It doesn't say that. Instead, he says he makes a vow to the storekeeper. So it sounds like Rabbi disagrees with the Mishnah. Amar Rava, po'alim nishba'in lebal habayit b'ma'amad chen vani ki hechi delichsefu mineh. Rava, however, says not necessarily. I think what the Baraita might mean is that the workers make a vow, in fact, to the boss, but they do so in front of the storekeeper, so that if they're lying, they'll feel more ashamed. It's hard to make a lie right to the face of the person who knows that you're lying. And so the boss actually doesn't know because he was not around. That's why he told the storekeeper, hey, can you give money to this worker? So we suspect that could be that the employee might lie in an oath to the boss. But if you bring the storekeeper there, storekeeper is going to make a face, what? How dare you lie? And he'll be more ashamed. And that's what it means that nishba'in lachen vani doesn't mean literally to the shopkeeper, but rather in front of the shopkeeper, but really the vow is to the boss. And in that case, this baraita by Rabbi Yehuda Nasi would be supporting the opinion in the Mishnah. So according to Rava, this baraita can be interpreted in line with the Mishnah, which means that Rabbi backed away from his question. Itemar shete kite adim hamachishot zo et zo. Now, a follow-up question about two sets of witnesses that contradict one another. For example, in this case was where we have the shopkeeper and the employee both made a vow, and one of their vows is a lie. So now a similar case where, let's say, two sets of witnesses, and one testified that something happened, one testified that it didn't happen in some case. And now they come to testify about a case in the future. Can we trust them? Machloket. Amar Rav Huna, zo ba bifnei atzma u'me'ida, vezo ba bifnei atzma u'me'ida. Rav Chisda amar behadeh sahadeh shakre lamali. Rav Huna said that the first set of witnesses, call them, set A, consisting of Mr. 1 and Mr. 2. So 1 and 2, if they come on their own in a new case, we trust them because although in the previous case they might have been lying, but that's 50% chance. So we're not going to disqualify them just based on the doubt. So they can testify in the future. And the other group, well, the same thing. We're in doubt. We don't know if they're the ones that were lying. So if they come to sign a document or a wedding or something, a crime or whatever happens, whatever that they're testifying about, we would trust them also. We would trust each one separately. What Rav Huna would say we do not trust is if one person from set A and one person from set B would come together, meaning Mr. 1 and Mr. 3, if they would come and join together, we would not trust them, because for sure one of them is lying, since one came from set 1 and one came from set B, and one of those sets were lying, so one of these individuals is lying, so we can't accept their testimony together. But as long as each one comes with the original set, so we can't tell which one is lying, and we will trust both of them separately. That's why he says me'ida, so b'fnei atzma u'me'ida. Rav Chisda, however, says, why should we involve ourselves with such liars? Two of these 4 people are liars, so forget about them. Let's disqualify all of them. And even if the 2 come in the same set, and we don't know for sure that they were liars, but kind of 50% chance that they are liars. So let's disqualify all of them. That's Rav Chisda is more stringent. Now we're going to bring a few scenarios and see how this machloket might apply. Shene malvin ushne lovin ushne shetarot. Hainu pilug taihu. Let's say you have 2 lenders, 2 borrowers, and 2 sets of witnesses. One, set A, is signed on one loan between borrower A and lender A, and there's the other set witnesses, set B, they're signed on the loan between lender B and borrower B. Well, if that's the case, that is exactly the subject of this machloket. According to Rav Huna, since they are each set of witnesses testifying about a separate case, completely separate documents, separate people. So we accept each of them separately, even though technically they can't both be right. But since they're separate, we accept this one, we accept that one, and we keep them apart. Whereas Rav Chisda would say, one of these is no good, so let's just throw out all of them. None of these will be valid. Okay, so that we know what the answer is. Malveh veloveh ushte shetarot yad ba'al hashtar ala tachtona. If there is one lender and one borrower and 2 loan documents, one loan document is signed by one set of witnesses and the other loan documents are signed by another set of witnesses, then the one who is holding the documents, that's the lender, he is at a disadvantage because the borrower can say, listen, there's 2 loan documents here that you have and you're claiming against me. Let's say one is for $100 and one is for $200, but the borrower says one of these is definitely a false document because it's signed by witnesses that are false because of these 2 sets of witnesses, one of they had before contradicted each other, so one of them is false, and therefore the borrower can say, I will only pay the lesser of the 2 because that's all you can prove. I actually have to pay. So that would be an extreme case, but everybody would agree that he would only have to pay one of them, and it would be the lower one. Shene malvin veloveh echad ushte shetarot hainu matnitin. If there are 2 lenders and 1 borrower, and there are 2 different documents. So one borrower, he is being claimed he has to pay from 2 different lenders. One lender comes and says you owe me, another lender comes and says you owe me, and they each have a loan document. Well, although each loan document is signed by a different set of witnesses, and one of them is definitely false, that's the same case as our Mishnah, and that borrower will have to pay both of them. Just like in the Mishnah, it's the boss that has to pay the storekeeper, and he also has to pay the employee, even though they're contradicting each other. But each of their claims by itself is valid, and so too here, each of their claims by itself is valid, and since they're 2 separate claims, we look at them separately, and even though they're against the same person, he has to pay both of them. Last case, shne lovin umave echad ushne shetarot mai teku. If there's one lender and he lent money to 2 different borrowers, and each one has his own document, and this lender comes to each one of them and says, hey, you have to pay me 100, and the other guy, you have to pay me 100, but only one of them does. So do we treat this also separately, just like in the Mishnah's case, and they both have to pay this guy? Or can the 2 borrowers come together and say, well, maybe his was the real one, and the witnesses on mine was fake, and the other guy could say the same thing, and so they can they both have a valid claim to say that they don't have to pay. So this question we left standing. And now one last similar case, Metiv Rav Huna Bar Yehuda. This is going to be a challenge against Rav Chisda, who was the more stringent one. Echad omer gavoa shete mardeot, ve'echad omer shalosh edutan kayemet. If you have two witnesses that come to testify about the new moon, and one said that I saw the moon 2 ox goads above the horizon. Ox goads were made of a fixed height. And so this was used as a standard measurement. So once is 2, once is 3. Well, they're close enough. Maybe it was somewhere around 2 or 3. So it could be that they both saw the same thing, and we will accept it. But echad omer shalosh ve'echad omer chamesh edutan betela umistarfin le'edut acheret. If one of them says he saw the moon 3 ox goads higher than the horizon, and one says 5, well, that discrepancy is too much, and therefore one of them is definitely lying. Now, even though we have 2 people here, and we know that one of them is definitely lying, we will accept if one of them joins someone else. Let's say the guy that said 3 has someone else that also said 3. So we'll allow them to join together. But how could we do that? Rav Chisda said that once we know that one of this set or that set are lying, then we reject all of them. And that's it. We throw them out. I don't want to deal with anyone who has a 50-50 chance of being a liar. So this is a challenge against Rav Chisda, because here we have a baraita that says that one of them can join with someone else. My lav le'edut mamon. So is this not talking about they can join together at some other point about a monetary thing? That one of these, the one that said 3, can join together in the future about some monetary thing, and it will be accepted. That would be a challenge against Rav Chisda. Amar Rava hu ve'acher mistarfin le'edut acher shel rosh chodesh tahave lehu terev echad ve'en davarav shel echad b'makom shenayim. Rava says no. Rav Chisda can explain this just fine. It does not mean that one of them, let's say the one that said 3, can join together with someone else in the future about a monetary claim. No, that's too much. He doesn't want to deal with anyone who is 50-50, has a doubt that he's no good. But what it does mean is that this guy who said 3 can join together with someone else who also said 3 regarding Rosh Chodesh, because at that point it would be 2 against 1. The guy who said 3 and some other guy that said 3, they're 2 witnesses, and they are much stronger than the one witness that said 5, and therefore just having that other witness there to back up the guy who said 3, that will make it clear that he was saying that he was truthful all along, and the guy who said 5 is the one that was a liar. And in that case, even Rav Chisda would agree that you can accept that one witness who joins together with someone else. Baruch Adonai le'olam, amen ve'amen.